Well, this morning we're going to be looking at this well-known story. It's a profound story, and I think it's a great story for baptism, but also for the day of Pentecost. It's a way of looking into what really happens in Pentecost. But today's theme, I'm going to call this message Coming Home, or Home at Last, something like that. Because there's something which happens to a person when they come to know God as Father, which is profound. It settles something in our souls. I once was reading a book by Ashley Brilliant, who once said, "It's a terrible thing to feel homesick even when you're home." I don't know if you've ever experienced that. You're at home and yet you feel homesick. I remember one time I was out with friends. We just had a wonderful day together. We'd been down the beach. We'd had fine wine, good food and friendship. And then we watched the sun set over a perfect day, finish a perfect day. And weirdly, strangely, I felt really at a strange kind of place of unease. I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was a kind of a nostalgic sense of paradise lost or something. You know, we all experience that. It's a strange depth, a profound feeling of, even though everything seems to be perfect, something is missing. And I've actually come to find out there's a word that describes that feeling. And once you've heard it, you're going to be using it all the time. And it goes like this. It's a German word. It's Untitled. Now, anyone who's German is going to say, "You pronounce that really badly." German, what a beautiful language. So romantic. But anyway, so Heimatlosigkeit. So next time someone, is at a party and says, "I don't know, I feel really strange. I feel ill at ease," you can say, "I know what's going on with you. It's Heimatlosigkeit." That's what it is. I don't know if you've ever come home from a party and looked at yourself in the mirror and said to yourself, "You're grounded." But you know what's probably actually going on is Heimatlosigkeit. That's what's going on. So, if nothing else, they should go away message. You know what that's called now. But of course, what it means is, and this word was coined by, the great existentialist, 20th century existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger. And what it means is something like a primordial yearning of the human spirit to be at home in a world that is structured for estrangement and metaphysical alienation. Isn't that a strange thing? How is it that we can be, even at home, and feel homesick? How is it that we can be in a world that has so much beauty in it, a beautiful creation, a beautiful day like this? Adelaide turns on the occasional day that is just perfect. I reckon today's one of those days. I lived in Sydney for a number of years. They have lots of really good days, but perfect days are very rare there. But Adelaide, every now and then, just turns on a perfect day. And yet, on a perfect day, you can feel ill at ease. How can that happen? What's going on there? Well, as much as Martin Heidegger wrote a whole book about that very subject to describe this generic unease that we human beings have, the human condition of being out of place in the world, a homesickness, even when things are going well, he's very late to the conversation, as it turns out. This is something which is well discussed and well understood in the scriptures. Even right back in the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis, it talks about this whole matter metaphorically when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Of course, Garden of Eden, I don't think we should take necessarily as a physical place on the map, so much as a state of being, and the state of being where we human beings are at one with God, at one with one another, and at one with the creation. What an extraordinary state that would be. You wouldn't get any of that homesickness in that kind of a state, but ever since Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, again, that's a metaphoric way of saying there was some kind of alienation between human beings and God, between each other and the creation. Something went wrong in that moment. And we've all got this primordial memory, some kind of collective memory trace of what paradise used to be like. And when you have a quiet moment, sometimes there is a nostalgic sense of loss. So what's the solution to that? Well, we'll get to that. But in this story of the prodigal son, to me, this is one of the most poignant stories that captures this whole idea of homelessness, spiritual homelessness, of the prodigal son, which we had read out to us today. And in that story, it follows a kind of a very predictable path. The prodigal son takes his inheritance and he heads off to the far country. Now, what the son is doing there, and of course in Jewish culture, to take your inheritance from the family property, and then take it when you were young, and then to head off to a far country, that would be incredibly insulting. The fact that Jesus even tells this story as if that could actually happen is extraordinary in itself. But what the son is virtually saying to his father is, Dad, you can drop dead, and as far as your family is, if the rest of the family is concerned, they might as well be dead. And off he goes to the far country. He takes his share of the inheritance and then spends it any way he likes. Or as the scriptures go on to say, he went and squandered his inheritance in wild living. And that little phrase there, wild living, could be translated as reckless, wasteful, heedless, and purposeless living. So he just went out and just did whatever. And doubtless it was partly to cover up the pain of being away from home, of being disconnected, the alienation that he was feeling. I'm sure that he was feeling some hymetlogiskite right there. It doesn't translate very well back into Greek and then back into English. But anyway, that's what was going on. He had that exact same experience. Now, the word prodigal actually means wasteful. That's where the term comes from. So the prodigal son is the wasteful son. He's taken his inheritance. He's taken his gift that he has from his family, and he's just thrown it away, squandered it. You know, it reminds me of a story I heard about an airline pilot addressing the passengers on a certain plane on the intercom saying, "This is your captain speaking. Unfortunately, I have to report that we're lost in a massive cloud bank and all our GPS and navigational instruments are down. However, you'll be pleased to know we're making excellent time." And I think, you know, half the world is going fast but going nowhere, making excellent time but going nowhere, not even having the faintest clue where it's all headed. And I reckon we Australians are pretty good at this. I reckon the prodigal son would have fitted in pretty well in Australia. I mean, after all, if anyone's good at prodigal wild living, it's us, Australians. We travel further more often than anyone else in the world. We drink more alcohol, consume more recreational drugs, and gamble more money per head of population than any nation on earth. Isn't that interesting? So here we are, we're affluent in a beautiful country, but I reckon we've got some serious homelessness going on, and that we're trying to dull the pain of that with all of these sedatives. But the party always ends. Eventually the party ends. And you have to come home and look at yourself in the mirror. And you begin to assess things again. Now, we've all done this. We've all looked at ourselves in the mirror, haven't we? And said, what were you thinking when you said that? What is wrong with you? Well, this is what people tell me anyway. And exactly the same thing happened for the prodigal son. He had all of this money, he had all of this wealth, and he was doing exactly as he pleased, but inevitably the money runs out, and the prodigal son winds up feeding pigs in the far country. Now, if you're a Jewish boy and you end up being a servant to a Gentile and feeding their pigs, that's about as low as it gets. You know, you've heard the term as popular as a pork chop in a synagogue. Yeah. Well, feeding pigs for a Jewish boy, this is rock bottom for him. He's just hit the bottom. And it was right at that point that Jesus goes on in the story to say in verse 17, and when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. So I'll set out," he said to himself, "I'll set out, I'll go back to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." Now, this is really interesting what's going on at that part of the story. Yes, he's come to his senses. Yes, he's realized he's in a terrible state and he needs help. Any psychologist will tell you that's one of the first and most important steps is to realize you've actually got a problem in the first place. He's come to this, he's realized something's wrong. I'm a mess. Everything's gone sideways badly. But his solution sounds good, but it's dead wrong. Because what he's wanting to do here is what I would call the second movement in this story. which is he's going to go back and do a deal with his father. Notice he says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. That's what he says to his father. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So I'll tell you what I'll do instead. Rather than starving to death in a pig farm, I want to trade my labor. I want to trade my time and be like one of your servants. Just live in, the servants' quarters out the back, and I realize I'm not worthy to be called your son, but I'm going to trade my time and at least have 3 square meals a day and a roof over my head. And so the son is trying to do a deal with his father. And people do this with God all the time. Many people come to the realization that something's really wrong, and they think, I've got to get things sorted with God, whatever God is to you. And so people make these deals with God. They come through a really difficult time, or they're in a really difficult time, or they find themselves at rock bottom, and maybe they've got cancer, or they've just been divorced, or bankruptcy's overtaken their business, or whatever else it might be. And people say, I'm going to do a deal with God. You hear these sort of things all the time. God, if you get me through this sickness, I'll go to church for the rest of my life. Or God, if you get me through this divorce, I'm going to serve you in any way you want me to. I'll I'll give money to the poor. I'll do whatever it is. And it's a strange thing that we human beings naturally, instinctively think we can trade with God. But I want to tell you something. The truth is, you cannot trade with God. That's just a fundamental truth which is hard to hear. But God doesn't, you can't give anything to God that he hasn't already got in one sense. You cannot trade with God. And if you try to, you will fall flat on your face. And yet, just about every religion in the world and every form of spirituality is built upon this principle that you can trade with God. You can trade ethical behavior or religious devotion for blessing and maybe heaven or something like that. But the truth of the gospel is you cannot trade with God. In fact, this is what happens to the young son. This son goes back to his father and he has his little prepared speech and he says, I want to enter into a contract. I want to enter into a transactional relationship with you. I'll trade my time and you'll give me 3 meals a day and a roof over my head. But the father will not allow him to do that. He doesn't even listen to his little speech. Instead, the father comes running down. He's been waiting for his son. He sees his son on the horizon and he runs towards him and embraces him and falls on his neck and kisses him. Stops his words with his kisses. Such is the nature of the Father. And what Jesus is telling us in this story, this is the nature of God the Father. This is what God the Father is like. You can't trade with God the Father. What you can do is receive a gift from him, and that gift is a gift of mercy. It's a gift of love, which you cannot earn. And even if you tried to earn it, you haven't got anything that could earn it anyway. So you cannot enter into a transactional relationship with God. Now, Jesus actually talked about this elsewhere in the scriptures in John chapter 8. He says that anyone who sins is a slave to sin. And then he went on and said this really profound thing. He said, a slave has no permanent place in the household. A slave is or a servant, is only as good as their last good act. And they can be fired like that any time. And so a slave or a servant is always looking over their shoulder thinking, have I done a good enough job? And they get obsessed with their performance and outdoing their competitors in the slave market, so to speak. And they're always worried, never secure, always thinking any moment I could be kicked out. No permanent place in the house. But Jesus went on and says, but the son is permanently in the household and is wonderfully free all of the time. And then he said, and that we probably all heard these words before, if the Son sets you free, then you shall be free indeed. Now what he's saying there is, he's really saying, I know you Israelites, he's speaking to Jewish people, and he's saying, you think you're free because of the law, but you're not. You're slaves. And you've got no permanent place in the house. But if you could know what it is to be a son like I am a son, if you could enter into my sonship, then you'd be so spectacularly, magnificently free, it would set you up in a way that you can't even begin to imagine. If you were free like I'm free in the house, with a permanent place, then you would be absolutely wonderfully free indeed. But he's not just saying that as some kind of wistful, aspirational thing. He's telling us that's the way it actually is. That's the truth. You can actually enter into the sonship of Jesus Christ. In fact, the story of the prodigal son goes on to say, when the father, or when the son finally came to his senses, went to the father, that the father actually didn't go into a little speech with him. He said immediately to his servants, hurry and bring the best robe and clothe him in it, put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, get the best calf and prepare it so that we can eat and celebrate for this son of mine who was dead, but now he's come back to life. He was lost, but now he's been found. And they began to celebrate. But you notice there's three things that the father put on the son. One was a robe, the second was a ring, and the third is sandals. Now, all three of those things are hugely significant. The first one, the robe, is the family colours. It's a special garment that only members of the family could wear in the colours of the family. And so it's signified he belongs to this family. He is my son. And the ring, of course, is a signet ring, and it would be the equivalent today of a credit card, an expense account with the family account. Don't we all want one of those? My children have got one of those, I can tell you. Anyway, so he gets the credit card, and the sandals indicate sonship instead of servanthood. You see, servants were barefoot, and the children in the family had sandals. So the father has re-sonned the son. He said, I won't have you as a slave. I will not have you as a servant. I'll only have you as my child, and that's the only way it's going to be. And the truth is, that's the only way God would have us. You cannot trade with God, but you can receive mercy. And mercy cannot be earned. If mercy could be earned, it wouldn't be mercy anymore, would it? Mercy is only given to those who don't deserve it. But God wants to give us this. This whole story is about the goodness of God, not about the cleverness of the son. And so the father re-sons the son, and something like that is true in baptism too. We're about to see a baptism today, because baptism signifies that we're taking off the old prodigal life and we're putting that aside and we're putting on a new garment, and that garment is the sonship of Jesus. We're putting on the acceptance and the knowledge that Jesus has of the Father. He's sharing that with us, and we're putting that on. So baptism symbolizes that, in the sense that you go down, the old life is buried, the old garments are taken off and new garments are put on, and new life is taken on board. And so, and I've got to say, baptism is not merely a symbolic act, as the Apostle Paul has it elsewhere. When we receive baptism, we're being baptized into the very life of Christ. And elsewhere, Paul talks about the Spirit. Of course, this being the day of Pentecost, it's good for us to remember these things. But he says in Romans 8, verse 15 to 16, he says, for you did not receive a spirit of slavery. Notice that? He's using the same kind of imagery. You didn't receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, back into the kind of trading with God thing. You're not going to be a slave who's trying to trade. But you have received the spirit of sonship. The spirit of Jesus Christ himself. And as Jesus said, if you knew what it is to be a son, then you'd be free. Well, Paul is saying that since Pentecost, that is true. The Spirit has been given and we've received a spirit of sonship. And as sons, he goes on to say, we cry out from our hearts, Abba, Father, which is almost equivalent to saying Daddy. It's an intimate connection. And the Spirit himself bears witness with our own spirits that we really are children of God. I tell you, in that state, you can't feel homeless. And here's the thing. It's a terrible thing to feel homeless when you're at home, or homesick when you're at home. But wouldn't it be amazing if you could be anywhere and feel at home? Well, you can. By the Holy Spirit, you can. We're so used to karma and spiritual merit. But we're not just tolerated servants of God. By the Holy Spirit, the Spirit whispers to our own spirits that we really are children of God. And Paul concludes this passage saying that if we are children, then we share in his treasures, and all the things that Christ claims as his own will belong to us as well. Isn't that amazing? And here's the thing. What is it that belongs to Jesus Christ, first and foremost? And I have to say this, the thing that Jesus has, the thing he wants to share with us, is his sonship, his knowledge of the Father, his intimacy with the Father. He wants you to know what it is to be a child in the family of God. And sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to get there. Sometimes we have to get to the end of our wild living and all of our addictions and depravity and all that stuff that drives us down to a place where we go, there's something wrong, I need help. And then to push through this desire to do a transaction with God and to receive the mercy of God, to receive the Spirit of God. And then faith allows us to receive the embrace of the Father, and by the Holy Spirit, you can come home. Amen.